We don't talk enough about inflation on this show. Washington tells you it's not happening, it's not real. Of course it's real. Look at the prices. Gasoline, real estate, you name it, they are all going up. What's going on here and what's going to happen next? Peter Schiff is the first person we called to answer these questions. You know a lot about the subject. He's the CEO of Euro-Pacific Capital and an economist. Peter, thanks so much for coming on tonight. What are we watching? It seems clear to consumers that inflation is happening. Will it get worse?
Well, it's going to get much worse, Tucker. You have to remember that inflation really is nothing more than a tax. You know, when the government spends money, they need to get the money. The public has to pay for it. Normally, the government would raise taxes, and then taxpayers send money to the government spends it. But we just passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. Nobody's taxes got raised, but we don't get all this government for free. What happens is the Federal Reserve prints the money, and then the government spends it into circulation. But when that happens, the value of all the money that's already out there goes down, and now the price of everything that you want to buy goes up. And that added price is basically the inflation tax.
It feels like it's intentional. I mean, is this the way that we're going to pay down the debt, by making it less costly, by devaluing the dollar?
Well, certainly, as you have inflation, you reduce the real value of the debt. But the government has no plan to pay off the debt. I mean, they're repudiating it. But the real problem is the amount of money they're going to have to spend just to finance all their current commitments. And this is a massive amount of money printing. It's unprecedented inflation because it's the money supply that is being inflated. And as a result, everything costs more because we're not producing more. It's actually the result, the opposite. Americans are at home. They're not producing goods and services, yet we're creating more money to buy the goods and services that fewer people are producing. More money, fewer goods. Prices are just going to keep going up, and it's not going to stop.
Just in 10 seconds, is this as crazy as it looks from an outsider's perspective?
Well, I don't know how it looks to an outsider, but I think to everybody that's living in the United States, it's not going to look pretty. And the real problem is the Fed. The Fed pretends that it's transitory, but when they have to admit that it's not transitory, the inflation rate will be far too high for the Fed to do anything about it, because if the Fed actually raises rates to fight inflation, they'll create a much bigger financial crisis than 2008, and the U.S. government will be forced into insolvency.
So, I mean, because our financial system is a global system, other countries, China most notably, buy U.S. treasuries with an expectation of return. If the value of the U.S. dollar starts falling as quickly as these numbers suggest it is, why would any country invest in U.S. bonds, in government bonds? I mean, doesn't this threaten to cause, a shakeup?
Well, they won't. Yeah, they're going to be selling U.S. treasuries. I mean, anybody that can connect these dots is going to be selling U.S. treasuries. And the problem is there's a lot of U.S. treasuries to be sold. And they talk a lot about the shortage of goods. The real problem is the surplus of money. Whenever you print a lot of money, it's always a good shortage, because the Federal Reserve can print all the money they want. But they don't print products to buy with the money. So we have all this money being printed. We're not producing a lot. People are sitting at home cashing unemployment checks. This is a tax. It is an inflation tax, a Biden tax, whatever you want to call it. But when Joe Biden says that, don't worry, only people that make over $400,000 a year are going to have to pay higher taxes to fund all these programs, he's lying, because every American is going to pay the inflation tax, and it's going to hit the middle class and the poor the hardest.
So I don't understand, since you just described it in the clearest possible way. When you print a ton of money, the value of that money falls. It's more money chasing fewer goods, fewer people working to make those goods. Of course, you're going to wind up where we are today, with massive disruptions to the labor market and spiking inflation. Why didn't any of the geniuses making these policies anticipate this?
Look, even the so-called geniuses at the Federal Reserve, they keep telling us not to worry because, according to them, it's all transitory. But these are the same guys that told us not to worry about the subprime mortgage market. Remember, early on, Ben Bernanke said, don't worry about subprime. It's contained. Well, now they're saying, don't worry about inflation. It's transitory. Inflation is as transitory now as the subprime market was contained. And this inflation crisis is not only going to be worse than the financial crisis, it's going to be worse than the pandemic, because the government's cure is what's going to kill the economy, not the disease itself.
Inflation's bad. It's at its highest level in more than a dozen years. Will it be getting worse? What does the future look like? Is this a snapshot or is it the new reality? Peter Schiff is an economist, CEO of Euro Pacific Capital. We're happy to have him on tonight. Peter, where do you see this going, inflation?
Well, it's already actually getting worse because the year-over-year number is 5%. But if you annualize the last 3 months, it's 8% increase. But I think the back half of the year is going to be a lot worse than the front half because businesses have been somewhat reluctant to pass on their exploding costs to their customers. I think they've been hoping the Fed was right, but I think they're going to give up hope later in the year, and they're really going to start increasing prices at a much greater rate.
Do you see a way out of it?
Well, unfortunately, no. I mean, the Fed is pretending that it's transitory because they really have no ability to control it because it's the Fed that's creating it. You know, Every dollar of government spending has to be paid for. And right now, they're not taxing in spending, they're printing in spending. So every time you're paying higher prices, you're really paying higher taxes. And taxes, unfortunately, are going way up, especially on the middle class.
But that won't reduce inflation.
No, that is inflation. The government is causing inflation. That's where all the stimulus money is coming from. The reason the economy looks like it's growing is because the government has created inflation, which creates the illusion of economic growth. But the reality is the economy is not growing. And, you know, the CPI doesn't even come close to capturing the real extent to which prices are rising. You know, a lot of people point to the 1970s and all the inflation we had back then. But we had a totally different CPI in the 1970s. If we were using the 1970 CPI today, we would already be experiencing double-digit inflation.
How long does inflation have to run above your target before the Fed decides maybe it's not so transitory?
So I think the word transitory has different meanings to different people. To many, it carries a sense of short-lived. We tend to use it to mean that it won't leave a permanent mark in the form of higher inflation. I think it's probably a good time to retire that word and try to explain more clearly what we mean.
So that's the current state of the cutting edge of financial journalism in this country. Peter Schiff is one of the few honest men left in that business, and we're happy to get his assessment tonight. Peter Schiff, thanks so much for coming on. So,
my pleasure.
This is a massive change, looking not at the CPI, but at the actual cost of living in the country. It's very obvious that the inflation rate is not 7%. It's much higher than that, in that it costs more than 7% to live here than it did last year. Why is this not on the front page of every publication?
Well, because the government, Wall Street, the Federal Reserve has a vested interest in the public not understanding how bad inflation is. In fact, one of the ways the Fed's been able to justify creating more inflation is because they claimed we didn't have enough of it. But the only reason we didn't have enough of it is because they were relying on their own highly rigged CPI. You know, the CPI wasn't always this dishonest. You know, when they compare our inflation rates to the inflation of the 1970s, we're not using the same CPI that we used then. The annualized rate of inflation so far, according to the CPI for 2021, is 7.3%. If you annualize the first 11 months, that's the worst rate since 1982. But if we were using the same CPI as we used in 1982, the rate would be closer to 15%, which means it's the worst year in inflation in U.S. history because the highest one year was 1980 when it was 13.5%. And this year, it's more than that.
So I guess I don't understand why no one's being punished for this crime. I see people destroyed, literally destroyed, for voting for the wrong person or hitting on the wrong person at a party or supporting their brother over text message or whatever. The people who destroyed the U.S. dollar seem to be getting away with it. How is that?
Yeah, well, they just renominated Powell to a second term, as if he did such a great job on his first term. It's a complete disaster. Of course, they might have replaced him with somebody even worse. But this is the only way the government can finance all the spending. You have the Democrats now promising all sorts of stuff for nothing. We're going to get free preschool. Everyone's going to get paid family and medical leave, and no one's going to have to pay for it. Nobody's taxes are going up. We're paying for it through inflation because the money to pay for all this government is being printed into existence, and then it's spent into circulation. And as it's spent into circulation, it's driving up prices. And when Jim Cramer was talking about all the money we're spending, yeah, the problem is we're not earning it, we're printing it, and then prices are going up. Our productivity is collapsing. We just got the worst productivity numbers in 62 years in this country. Our trade deficits are exploding. The economy is imploding. It is a mess. We just can't see it because we're blinded by all the inflation.